Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the future of Petrocaribe. As you know, Petrocaribe is a very important form of financing for the region, yet in some sense, we haven't observed a lot of discussion around the impacts for business of potential changes to the agreement. So we want to take this opportunity to address the issue that could otherwise become a blind spot for business in the region. Given the strained economic situation in Venezuela, this is the perfect time to be having this conversation, so we're really happy to have such a broad and diverse crowd joining us today. The agenda we planned for you today is going to begin with an overview of the agreement, the Petrocaribe arrangement, and then we'll evaluate the economic situation in Venezuela. And that'll really give us a feel for the sustainability of the program going forward. Thirdly, I'll be going over what changes to the current scheme, the current Petrocaribe scheme, really could mean for the region. We'll also take a look into some of the alternative strategies available for the beneficiary countries. And finally, we'll look at how these changes could impact your business and your bottom line. At the end, we'll have a question and answer session, so please, take notes of anything that you'd like to go into further at the end of the session. So briefly, we'll just start with an overview of some of the basics on Petrocaribe. Venezuela's used this as a mechanism to position itself as a lead financier in the region. And Petrocaribe it's an energy cooperation agreement that provides oil under special financing conditions. Petrocaribe was created 8 years ago, and there are currently 17 countries participating, plus Venezuela. Under the agreement, as the oil price increases, the amount of long-term financing available to member countries actually grows. So what we can see is that when the barrel's at $40, only 30% of the price of the barrel of oil will be financed long-term. And as it moves up to $100 per barrel, this would be as much as 60% that could be financed long-term. The remaining portion is paid in cash in 30 to 90 days. And when the barrel's above $40, the financing conditions actually are even better. Countries can then receive a 2-year grace period, and the long-term debt is financed at 1%. So we'd be looking at a total of 25 years financing. Additionally, the debt can be paid in currency or in goods or services. So Petrocaribe addresses 2 issues for the region. First, it provides a cheap long-term financing mechanism of 1% interest. And secondly, it relieves pressures on the balance of payments because less currency is required to pay for the oil that we are so heavily reliant on here in the Caribbean. So now the question arises as to whether or not this mechanism is sustainable for Venezuela. So the next few slides are going to give us an overview of the current economic situation in Venezuela, which should provide us some context to address that question. In the graph on the left, we can clearly see that the impact of rising oil, what the impact of rising oil prices is on exports. And I really want to draw attention because it's important to note that the impact of oil prices versus production on oil exports is what's really moving that blue line up. But what's really important here is the gray line. Non-oil exports in Venezuela's non-oil exports have dropped by nearly 1/3 since 1998. And as a matter of fact, Venezuela is more dependent on oil than it's ever been before. 96% of total goods exports last year were oil exports. When we further distill the data, we can see that only about 1.5% of the total non-oil export, total exports, goods exports, were actually attributable to the private sector. The exchange rate overvaluation has really disfavored exports, which is what we're starting to see here. So on the other hand, if we look toward the other graph, we can see that imports are rising at a very fast pace. And since the Bolivar remains overvalued, it's cheaper to import than to produce domestically. Imports reached $59 billion last year, and that's 3.5 times what they were in 2004. The compound annual growth rate of imports since 1998 has been 16%. If we look into specific categories, we can see, for example, food imports have grown 5 times between 1998 and 2012. Oil imports have also grown substantially. We can see that here on the graph. Oil imports accounted for 20% of total imports last year, and that compares to only 9% in 1998. And the mechanism that's financing this import boom in Venezuela is oil. Now, before I leave this slide, this doesn't tell the whole balance of payments story. And I think it's important to draw attention to that. In 2012, Venezuela produced a global balance of payments deficit of nearly $1 billion. And in the first half of 2013, the balance of payments deficit was $1.9 billion. Now, on the next slide, we'll take a look at Venezuela's international reserves position. International reserves are now at the lowest level since 2004. In fact, international reserves have fallen 27% year to date in 2013. What's even more concerning here is that the majority of reserves are held in gold. And we all know that gold is very highly vulnerable to price fluctuations. And it's estimated that only 12 to 15% of reserves are actually liquid. So that would put the liquid reserves in Venezuela at very best at about $3 billion. Import coverage is right now at the lowest level since the 1950s. If we look to the graph on the right, we can see that what we call the black market, or the parallel exchange rate, is currently over 8 times the official exchange rate. The black market rate has increased by more than 85% since the announcement of Chavez's death. Additionally, with the recent dismissal of Merentes as vice president of the economy, there's even more uncertainty around the Venezuelan government's economic policy. So look, in the context of low reserves, high imports, fiscal deficit, devaluation is forthcoming. And these economic pressures, they're further compounded by the internal pressures they're mounting around inflation and scarcity. Inflation in Venezuela is the highest in the Americas and one of the highest in the world. In September, annualized inflation reached 49.4%, and that's 31 points higher than where it stood in September of last year. Monthly inflation has averaged 3.7% year to date in 2013. The high inflation impacts the most vulnerable sectors, right? Because they dedicate most or all of their salary to food. You know, as a data point in August, one minimum wage could only pay for 84% of the regulated food basket. Now, this couples with scarcity. Scarcity is now at a 5-year high. 1 of every 5 products is not available. The scarcity index has been over 20 in 6 of the first 9 months of this year. And 2008 was the last time that the scarcity index had surpassed 20. So it's really important to consider that as Venezuela's economic situation worsens, pressures are rising for the government to address the needs of the people of Venezuela. I have one more slide where we can look at some of the trends associated with oil in Venezuela, and this is very important to take into account. Oil consumption is clearly on the rise. Gasoline is highly subsidized in Venezuela. Say that at the current black market rate, exchange rate, with tip included, you can actually fill your tank in Venezuela with 10 cents of a US dollar. In fact, oil consumption has risen 63% since Chavez took office. So, consumption is rising and production is falling. Production ended 2012 down by more than 20% with respect to where it stood in 1998. The chart on the right shows us that Venezuela's oil imports are growing. And we're up by 800% in the first half of 2013 compared to the first semester of 2005. For the 1997 to 2013 period, the compound annual growth rate of oil imports for the first 2 quarters was almost 19%. Since 1997, oil imports have grown by 15.5 times. Now, if we look at PDVSA's consolidated financial statements, it indicates that over 40% of the volume of crude exported was actually accounted for by economic cooperation agreements. 15% of this was Petrocaribe. More than 20% was with China, and 4% with other countries. So, given this context, we believe that changes are on the horizon. And these may come in several forms. They could come as an increase to interest rates, as a reduction to the term of the loans, or a reduction to the quotas. Venezuela could simply underserve the quotas that it's already committed to. Other changes could include Venezuela seeking preferential pricing for goods and services that they receive in payment. Now, we must say that Petrocaribe has been a key device of Venezuelan foreign policy, and we expect the Venezuelan government to maintain an agreement in place as long as they can. The other thing I would like to point out here is that the Petrocaribe agreements are structured as one-year contracts, automatically renewable. And in order for Venezuela to modify or end the agreement, only 30 days advance notice is required in writing and through diplomatic channels. So, in that context, I'd like to now turn our attention to the risk factors associated with a possible end or modification changes to Petrocaribe for the beneficiary states and the region. Caribbean states are typically net importers and consistently record current account deficits, and this is the issue that Petrocaribe set out to correct. So, if we look at some concrete examples of this, we can see that Guyana spends about $200 million a year on fuel imports. Dominica spent $52 million last year. St. Lucia imported 1.4 million barrels of oil, diesel, LPG, 4% more than they had the prior year. For St. Lucia, last year's fuel bill was about $300 million, which is 3 times where it stood a decade ago. The large current account deficits put pressure on the balance of payments and on international reserves. The Central Bank of Belize, they attributed the growth in their foreign reserves for Q1 of this year to a $36 million disbursement under Petrocaribe. So, since assuming a $100 barrel of oil, 60% of the Petrocaribe oil cost would be deferred, clearly we can see that the changes to the agreement would put additional pressures on these already large current account imbalances, which have persisted even when the countries are receiving financed oil under the agreement. Another place that we would expect to see impacts is through inflation. Now, we must be clear that Petrocaribe fuel doesn't necessarily work as a direct subsidy to electricity production in all cases. And it does benefit other sectors such as education, low-income housing, agriculture. This year in Grenada, the national budget calls for 30% of the estimated Petrocaribe financing to be dedicated to school feeding, scholarships, education, employment, and development programs. So there's a lot of other areas that changes to this financing scheme will impact. And if we look at energy costs across the Petrocaribe region, we can observe that the contribution of energy prices as a weight of the consumer price index is very elevated. So prices would undoubtedly face pressures in the case of changes to the Petrocaribe agreement. So one of the things that Petrocaribe has done, in some sense, is to transform a current account issue into a debt issue. Regional debt to GDP ratios are high. 9 of the Petrocaribe beneficiaries had a gross debt to GDP ratio of over 60% last year. And look, at an interest rate of 1%, Petrocaribe is clearly a low-cost mechanism for finance. Many governments have taken advantage of the Petrocaribe funds for large-scale infrastructure projects and for different capital investment programs. The Central Bank of Belize, they reported in their March quarterly review that, and I'm going to read this, I want to read this word for word because I think it's important. It says, the one-off cash flow ease obtained from the agreement, the Petrocaribe agreement, was used to make just one interest payment on the 2038 bond that was issued in March in replacement of the 2029 bond. So, you know, the Bank of Guyana reports that the obligations to Venezuela grew by 27% to the end of last year. And it also made up 27% of the total external debt. The Bank of Guyana also indicates that the central government's debt service decreased by 3.3% due to the lower principal payments to Venezuela under Petrocaribe. So under a scenario of changes to Petrocaribe, fiscal pressures in the region would increase. And Venezuela has become a lead financier for the region under the deal. So now we'll move on to some alternate solutions and strategies that are available to the beneficiary countries. One of the key things to keep in mind is the issue that Petrocaribe set out to solve. Here I'm referring to the vulnerability of the region's economies, the oil price shocks. And Petrocaribe has not been widely used to lower dependence on oil, and has thus not been an effective mechanism for reducing balance of payments exposure for the region's energy sector. The chart on the left, it shows us just how fossil fuel dependent the region's gen park is. In addition to this, the region's generation park is very aged. Earlier this month, I heard Kelly Tomlin of the Jamaica Public Service at a conference, and you know, she was indicating that 350 megawatts of the company's 650 peak is produced on plants that are over 50 years old, right? So obviously we're looking at not just a fossil fuel dependent gen park, but an old and inefficient one. So on the energy side, this certainly opens up a series of opportunities for the private sector to step in, particularly in the areas of renewables and green energy. The region needs to work really toward freeing itself from oil for its energy needs. This has to be understood from a complete value chain perspective. Okay, so involving actors from multiple sectors, private sector legislators, regulators. The local financial sector can play an important role, especially in supporting renewable energy projects, particularly in providing assistance that can help the projects understand what's needed to become bankable. Okay, but that's one of the challenges for renewables projects, right? And you know, from a standpoint of regulations, there's many changes underway to facilitate the introduction of renewable capacity, such as net metering, examples of tax incentives, exemptions on renewables imports. And the Petrocaribe member countries, they're taking steps in this direction. Jamaica's about to launch another bid for 37 megawatts of renewable energy, and they just completed a tender for 78 megawatts of renewables. Antigua's government recently announced that they'd be using $9 million in donor funding to generate 25 megawatts of energy through renewables. And they actually intend to make the government 100% RE fueled. And they've already achieved 10 to 15% reduction in government energy consumption. That's through the PV demonstration plant that they put up at the Education and Tourism Ministries. In Dominica, the Caribbean Development Bank and AID Bank, they're collaborating on a program to promote renewable initiatives in small businesses. So AID Bank will offer a concessionary rate of 5%, and this is on solar, hydro, biomass, wind, geothermal, etc. It applies to loans over 10K US. The Guyana Energy Agency, they've requested full duty exemptions on equipment for generating energy from renewable sources. So, this includes solar panels, lamps, solar generators, solar water heaters, deep cycle batteries, solar cookers, LED lights, water turbines, etc. So what's really key here is to continue to evaluate different alternatives that help drive a reduction in the need for oil imports. Now, concerning the other piece of Petrocaribe, low-cost financing. Another opportunity for the region, like Petrocaribe, with 1% long-term financing, is not likely to reoccur. I mean, you have to keep in mind that even PDVSA, as a point of reference, PDVSA is Venezuela's national oil company. They pay a 12.75 coupon on their 2022 bond. So PDVSA does not even have access to 1% financing, and PDVSA is actually commissioned with developing the world's largest oil reserves. So, the likelihood of another 1% long-term financing, it's just not that probable for the region, right? So this is something that, while it's there, certainly needs to be taken advantage of. And there are, however, other opportunities, and here I'm referring to, through multilateral channels, funding agencies, the Caribbean Development Bank, which I just mentioned before. The IFC has funded over $2 billion in the Caribbean since 2000. The Latin America Development Bank, the CAF, which Jamaica and Dominican Republic have access to. The IDB also has initiatives throughout the region. This is obviously not an exhaustive list, but one of the advantages of working with these organizations, in addition to the funding, they also provide technical assistance for the governments, for the regulators, and the other stakeholders. And this, what it does is it'll actually make sure that the intended outcomes are met. And this brings us to the final question of how will the end of Petrocaribe impact your business? So look, a deterioration of the balance of payments and international reserves positions could generate pressures on currencies. So looking at currency pressures, what this could really mean is an increased risk where you have multiple currency exposure, which we're all too familiar with in this region. So there's several measures you can take to mitigate this. You can, reduce your net exposure by matching foreign assets to foreign liabilities. You can reduce your contractual exposure denominated in foreign currency. Of course, you can hedge. You can run profit sensitivities on your FX gains and losses. The other place to be looking is that currency fluctuations would increase the cost of imported production inputs. This is both physical inputs and financial inputs. So thinking along those lines, for an example, this is a time to run evaluations on the sensitivity of long-term liabilities to import prices. A good example of this would be pension plans, right? Healthcare equipment, medication, they're often imported. Under FX fluctuations, this could alter pension plan costs, right? So we have to look at both the P&L and the balance sheet and really find where these impacts may arise. On the inflation side, we know that FX fluctuations would create further inflationary pressures. This would add to the higher energy and financing costs that the markets would already be feeling, okay? So this could drive up operational costs, and as a rise in energy costs per unit are increased, particularly in the presence of FX pressures, right? So, we'll really start seeing some changes to the cost structure as a result of this. Along these same lines, energy conservation and the reduction of consumption, those are going to be key aspects to offsetting the rising costs. And those are the types of things that we can start planning for now and we can start looking at now. Hedging instruments can also be used to protect, especially against raw materials prices increases. Another thing that we've seen, used a lot throughout this region, and that's been successful to protect against these same external types of shocks, is flow-through pricing mechanisms. These can be put in place. They'll reduce the risk associated with your exposure to vendors, right? Another thing to really understand about inflation in your market is how a drop in available income affects consumer confidence in your market and consumer spending in your market, right? So this gives us some space to play with diversifying your product mix, identifying new channels, new markets. And look, at the end of the day, risk isn't a bad thing as long as you're able to anticipate it. And that is exactly what this conversation is about. So look, I hope we've provided you with some actionable insights today. I'd like to invite you all to take a deeper look at all of the areas of risk that could impact your business, especially throughout this wide and diverse region. We do make a lot of tools available in order to really understand these risks. So I invite you all to look into market dynamics, which is a great tool for doing this in the region. And now we're going to go ahead and pass on to the question and answer section. So if there's anything you'd like us to go a little bit deeper on, or if you have any follow-up questions, just go ahead and either tweet them through the channel, or you can just post them on here. So thank you very much for your time, and we really hope this is a useful discussion in helping you make some decisions.